Dude, I totally forgot to do that. Sorry, Steve. But I wanted to kind of kick off the morning with starting with an apology on confusion in regards to the order of speakers. I appreciate y'all hanging out and hanging on with me as we work this out and that. So I am really excited to introduce Hannah, and I'm also excited to hear that she has joined the Force of Social Work. And she's actually joining us from North Carolina, and that Hannah moved a couple years ago down there and that, but before that she was here in Michigan, and she actually started off with our regional youth internship. And through that program, it's a peer-led youth leadership development program. And through it, Hannah did some really amazing work in that and created this like really awesome interactive workshop / simulation that talked about the school to prison pipeline and that. And unfortunately, because of COVID, I don't really want to put people like so close together because you will get close with this game in that. But Hannah has really used her expertise as well as the relationships and that she has in order to help shape and develop that program and that. And so Hannah's going to be talking with us today about the school to prison pipeline. All right.
As for the introduction, you covered most of what I was going to say about myself. I started at the roundtable. I'm currently studying social work at North Carolina State University. I moved here in 2019, like 2.5 years ago. And I got my start at the roundtable, as she said, and I've continued on in the work of social justice and nonprofit. And I currently work at the National Institute for Minority Economic Development in Raleigh, North Carolina. I work in Raleigh, but the Institute is in multiple states. So that's what I'm doing now. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that I can show you the little presentation I have. Okay, so as we said, we're going to be talking a little bit about the school to prison pipeline today. This is something truly I could talk about for like an hour. Also, just to let you know, I have my cats in here, so if you see them walking around, I'm sorry. If I shut the door, they're going to scream and you're going to hear it. I let them in, they act like toddlers. So if they're distracting, I'm sorry. But we're gonna talk a little bit about the school to prison pipeline. I could talk about this for like an hour, but we're trying to keep it a little bit shorter. So I have some links for further reading. If anybody would like them afterwards, we can have some questions. I have some sources that I can give out. But for now, I'm gonna try to keep it, keep everyone not here for an hour. So I'm gonna-
Hannah, if you send it to me and we'll actually share it and get it up online.
Okay, awesome. So I'm going to start with a little overview just of what we're going to talk about. We're going to start with some basic demographic information. I'm focusing on Detroit because I think that Detroit specifically as a city, it's well known, it's a big city, and it's a great example of a lot of what the school to prison pipeline is. So we're going to talk about what the school to prison pipeline is, and then the different stops along the pipeline, which are inadequate resources, zero tolerance policies, reliance on police in schools, alternative schools, and then we're going to talk a little bit about mass incarceration and solutions for parents and children. So a case study on Detroit, we're starting with Detroit because like I said, it's a great example and it's a very well-known major city and it's nearby. So we have some basic demographic information. I think it's important to provide context in conversations like this, just so we know a little bit of what we're talking about. First, the estimated median household income in 2019, which is the last year that you can get this data, was about $34,000 a year, which was up from about $29,500, but it's still lower than the actual state average. So overall, still a low income city, but it is going up. The employment rate is 9.3% as of September of this year. The state unemployment rate is 4.6% and the national is 4.8%, so it's much higher. 30.6% of residents in Detroit are living in poverty. And then this is also broken down by race. So that's 29.5% of Black residents and of white residents, 36.5% for Latina residents, 46% for Native American residents, about 47% for Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islanders, about 36 for other races, and 38 for residents of 2 or more races. One thing that's very interesting that I want to point out that I've noticed not just here, but also where I live now here in Wake County in Raleigh, Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander group are a very small part of the population, but they have extremely high rates of poverty, extremely high rates of suspension in schools, and extremely high dropout rates. But despite all of that, their test scores tend to be on par with average. And I think that because of their low numbers in the population, they tend to get overlooked. So that's just something that's notable as a group that tends to get forgotten that I want to make sure that we are actively including. When it comes to education in the city, about 84% of the residents have a high school degree, and then after that, it really drops off. Only about 17% have a bachelor's degree and 7% with a graduate degree. And then we're talking about the schools now. So this year, the 2020 to 2021 school year, there were about 49,000 students enrolled in Detroit public schools. Less than 1% American Indian, Alaska Native, about 1% Asian, majority African American, about 82%. And then second most is Hispanic or Latina with around 14%. Less than 1% Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander, less than 1% 2 or more races, about 2.5% white. And then the vast majority are also economically disadvantaged, which means that they qualify for free or reduced lunch. About 11.5% do not speak English as their first language, and about 14.5% are disabled. I wasn't able to find a specific definition for what is meant by disabled, but in my experience, typically that means physical disabilities, which would include like Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, learning disabilities like ADHD and dyslexia, and it also includes emotional disabilities like depression or PTSD. So what is the school to prison pipeline? The ACLU defines the school to prison pipeline as a disturbing national trend wherein children are funneled out of public schools and into the juvenile and criminal justice systems. Many of those children have learning disabilities, are living in poverty, or have a history of neglect and abuse at home. They have other issues that they're struggling with and would very much benefit from other forms of intervention, but they're not getting that. Instead, they're just being isolated and pushed out of school. There are 4 stops along the school to prison pipeline. The first one is inadequate resources in public schools. The second is zero tolerance policies. The third is reliance on police. And the fourth is alternative schools, which are usually not held to the same standard. So stop number 1, inadequate resources. You guys may remember, I know I remember this very well. In 2016, Detroit teachers made national news through rolling sick-outs to protest the conditions in their schools. They actually are not allowed to strike. It's illegal for teachers in Michigan to strike because they're considered employees of the government. So they got around that by doing what they called sick-outs. They all called in sick at once. And some of the conditions that they were protesting were mold. There was one teacher who's told a story about a leak in the gym that led to the entire area of the school being condemned due to black mold. Leaks, extreme temperatures where students were having to wear winter coats into class because it was so cold, incomplete fire alarm systems and other fire hazards like electrical panels. And as of 2019, Detroit schools needed nearly $543 million in repairs, but at the time they were not able to afford this. They were expecting to have to wait around 4 years. So by 2023, the year that they feel they'll be able to start doing these things, that's estimated to cost them nearly $1.5 billion. Also in 2019, there was a group of students from 5 of Detroit's worst performing public schools that actually sued the Michigan Department of Education and Governor Gretchen Whitmer. They are suing on the basis of literacy. They're saying that they did not receive the education that they needed to succeed and be as literate as their counterparts from other schools. These are students that went on to go to college and felt they were vastly behind the other students in their classes. They alleged in the lawsuit that they had lack of up-to-date books. So some of the books were so out of date that they were not useful at all. And some of the books were labeled to be used for elementary school and kindergarten. They had classrooms without teachers. Specifically in the lawsuit, they said that there was one time they were put into a classroom and they watched the Disney movie Frozen because there was no teacher. They found things like dead vermin, bullets, and other illicit items on their playgrounds. Extreme temperatures again, black mold. unsafe drinking water, inefficient bathrooms, and being served moldy and expired food at lunchtime. This is also just getting worse because of COVID-19. The COVID-19 pandemic led to a widespread shift in instruction from in-person to online. But to have effective online instruction, the student needs a laptop, computer, or smartphone, adequate internet, and they need to be able to understand how to use the resources that are available to them. And that's relevant to the students, the parents, and the teachers. A lot of teachers, the last time there was a survey done, which was back in 2012, I believe, only 1/3 of teachers said that they had received training on how to use technology in the classroom. This is the percentage of households in Michigan that don't have high-speed internet access, almost 32%. And the percentage of households in Michigan that don't have a laptop or computer, about 25%. This chart is showing how often students said that they needed to do these different things. So we have students that said they often or sometimes have to do their homework on a cell phone, are unable to complete their homework because of a lack of reliable internet connection, or they have to use public Wi-Fi to do their homework because they don't have internet at home. Especially in these last two, being unable to complete your homework or having to use public Wi-Fi, we can see that the race and the household income very much affect whether or not these students are experiencing these situations. And for the last one, using public Wi-Fi, this is especially bad in certain areas of different cities, like Detroit, for example. There might not be a space near them that they can access where they can even get to the public Wi-Fi. And if there is, say there is a McDonald's down the street, what if you live in a neighborhood where it's not safe to walk there by yourself and sit there all day as a 15-year-old? They are completely lost and they can't keep up with other students who have these means. So overall, we're seeing that Detroit and Michigan overall have struggled to provide students with adequate resources for quite some time, and the gap is only growing larger because of the pandemic. The second stop is zero tolerance policies. Zero tolerance policies are a form of school discipline in which students are immediately removed from school as discipline for qualifying infractions. They were originally designed to keep schools safe, but they end up doing more harm than good. We saw the rise of zero tolerance in the aftermath of the Columbine high school shooting in the late 1990s. And it was designed so that if you did something violent in school, if you brought in drugs, if you brought in a weapon, if there was gang violence, immediately you were out to keep the other students safe. But as we're seeing in this infographic, there's 4 different ways that they are harming students. Number one, they disproportionately affect students of color and low-income students. So students of color, students with disabilities or special needs, and LGBT students. Number 2, they're negatively impacting student learning. You can't learn if you're not in school. You just can't. They elevate dropout rates and they supply to the school to prison pipeline. One of the leading reasons for students dropping out of high school is just not returning after a long-term suspension. That's one of the top 5 reasons. It's just not coming back after a suspension. And lastly, they create self-fulfilling prophecies for students. The teachers, you're teaching them that you don't want them to come to school. They don't want to come into school. They feel like they're not good enough. They feel like they're just going to get in trouble, and it discourages them. And eventually they don't succeed. If you treat them like a problem, they become a problem. In 2017, Detroit students cumulatively missed nearly 50,000 school days due to out-of-school suspensions. And over 45,000 of those days were missed by Black students, which is a huge number. When I saw this, I thought maybe they accidentally added an extra 0, but that's it. 50,000 days were missed by students who were suspended. A short case study on zero tolerance. In the summer of 2019, there were 4 students that snuck into Joy Prep in Detroit through a window. They stole a couple of popsicles for themselves and they left. They were suspended for the remainder of the school year, which was about 3 weeks, and they were told that they could not come back until their parents came and had a conversation with the school board. At this point, there had already been laws enacted to try to mitigate the effects of these zero tolerance policies. And the laws say that school boards are to consider 7 different factors before deciding whether to suspend or expel a student. And the 7 factors include things like the age of the student, the offense, and their disciplinary history. But those 7 factors were not mentioned in the meeting minutes at all from Joy Prep. And the ACLU and other advocates say that laws like that are a huge improvement, but schools are given too much leeway to demonstrate that they considered the 7 factors. There's no regulation for how they have to consider them. Essentially, it's a loophole. They just have to say they did it. They don't actually have to do it. They can get away with it. So some advocates also are believing that expulsions are just being replaced by suspensions, because even as expulsion rates are going down, suspension rates are going up in tandem. So overall, zero tolerance policies are doing more harm than good, particularly to students of color. And although new laws have been enacted to overhaul discipline in Michigan schools, they're not working as well as they would be if they were adequately enforced. The third stop is reliance on police in schools. This is wild to me. This one is wild to me. The Detroit Public Schools Community District, which predominantly serves Black and brown students, as we know, is the only public district in Michigan with its own police department, and it's one of only a few in the entire country. While under state emergency management in 2011, this is crazy to me. I don't remember this at all. Some of you guys might. Detroit Public Schools broke ground on a $5.6 million command center to improve the district's safety. And their original plans for the center called for a canine unit, holding cells, and a security system that would have had state-of-the-art cameras and alarms in every school so that they could sit in this command center and monitor all of the schools at once. And at one point, the Detroit Public Schools Police Department was actually in possession of 2 military vehicles. They had military vehicles donated to their school police. Upon entering the district, though, the former chief of police, Ralph Godby, he gave those vehicles to another police entity. He seems like a really good guy. He seems like he really understands the role that policing in schools has in pushing children into the school to prison pipeline. And it seems like a lot of the good that has happened in Detroit schools happened while he was the chief. So that's a positive. I can't believe that anyone ever sat down and said, we should build a jail for our students. It just, I don't know, it doesn't make sense, but that's what's going on. And here we have another infographic. In Michigan, 1.7 million students are in schools with cops but no counselors. 3 million are in schools with cops but no nurses. 6 million are in schools with cops but no psychologists. And 10 million are in schools with cops but no social workers. So overall, we're seeing a heavy reliance on police and not on people who can actually address behavioral issues in students. As of February of this year, the superintendent was open to the idea of defunding the police in the schools, but hasn't really taken any action other than just like saying it on Twitter. They've tweeted about it, but there was a meeting at U of M in February about defunding the police. They did not attend. So they seem open to it, but they haven't really taken any actual concrete action. Police presence in schools overall, it's agreed upon that it discourages children from attending schools, and relying on police does not solve the root causes leading to those behavioral issues. It just punishes the children. And the fourth stop is alternative schools. Our alternative schools are often not held to the same standards as traditional schools. They can have their own grading systems as well that don't have to match what traditional schools do. Often this is viewed too, and has been coined in some areas as the new white flight, because charter schools especially are increasingly serving relatively able white students rather than improving outcomes for disadvantaged students as they originally promised. They're not required to provide much of anything. And 2 of those big things they're not required to provide are transportation and meals. So any students whose families are relying on busing, students who normally have to walk to school, students whose families can't afford to send a lunch with them, they end up getting left behind. And the students who are able to leave do. They're generally not improving conditions for disadvantaged students. That's the main point. They're not improving the conditions as they promised they would. And I don't know about Michigan, but I know where I live now in Wake County, you can also essentially gerrymander your charter school. So the law says that you have to represent the community that the charter school is sitting in, but you can draw that district line however you want to. So you can have a charter school that's sitting in a majority Black neighborhood, but is enrolling only white students, and it's still legal because it literally is gerrymandering, but for your school. I wasn't able to find anything other than in Michigan, it is illegal to discriminate, but as we know in practice, laws that say don't discriminate don't always exactly work. So I do think there could be some more concrete rules on that. A little bit about mass incarceration in Michigan, because that's essentially what the school to prison pipeline leads to. I'm sure most of us have heard this third grade thing. Third grade is the point at which school performance becomes a major indicator of a child's likelihood to succeed. There is a myth that third grade reading levels determine whether or not a child is going to end up in prison. That's only partially true. If your child has low reading levels in the third grade, chances are that they're going to have school issues and behavioral issues, and that's going to push them down that school to prison pipeline. It is not true, if you have ever heard this, it is not true that like private prisons are looking at your kids' test scores. So this is a major indicator. It's very important, but just kind of dispelling that myth that like private prisons are looking at test scores. That's not happening. This is the incarceration rate in Michigan, 599 out of every 100,000 people. This doesn't seem like that big of a number. It's like 0.5%, 0.6%. To me, that doesn't seem like a big number, but it's huge. Michigan actually has one of the highest incarceration rates out of every democracy in the world, not just the United States, the entire world. And of course, as we all know, people of color, especially Black people, are overrepresented in Michigan's prisons and jails. We saw just now the rate was 599 per 100,000 people for just the general Michigan population. For Black people, it's nearly 4 times that. And here we're also seeing that prison admissions rates don't correlate with crime rates. This one's a little harder to make out because these graphs are from 2 different sources. But basically what we're looking at is on the left, this little map over here, darker color means higher crime rate. And over here on the right, darker color means higher prison admission rate. But they don't correlate. So you can see on the left right here, we're seeing darker right here, right along the river, higher crime rate. But over here, we're seeing lighter color, lower prison admission rate. And same with right here, we're seeing this darker color, meaning there's a higher prison admission rate. But that corresponds to right here on this map, which has a much lower crime rate. So we're not seeing a match between where people are getting arrested and sent to prison and where the crimes are actually happening. So the effects of mass incarceration clearly are very prevalent in Detroit and across the state of Michigan. So what can we do about that? What can we do for our parents? What can we do for our children? These are just a couple of the things off the top of my head that I thought of that students can be struggling with that makes them have a hard time in school. They might be struggling to understand the subject material. They might not have the motivation or the interest in school and learning. They might be struggling to manage their emotions. They might be struggling to focus due to external factors like hunger or issues at home, and they might not have access to the necessary materials. So what all can we do to help them? We can increase access to tutoring for students who need extra help. Check with your child's school or your local library if your child is in need of help to see if they offer free help after school. We can encourage our students, show an interest in what they're doing. When they come home, ask them, how was your day? I know I was the one in high school, my parents would be like, Hannah, how was your day? I'd be like, it was fine, nothing happened. I know they seem so annoyed when you ask them, but it does make a difference. It does. When you ask them, how was your day? And you show your interest. Support programs that increase social workers and counselors in schools. And you can perhaps also support programs that decrease that presence of police in schools. We need people who will attack those root issues, what's causing students to act out, what's causing students to struggle, rather than just relying on punishment. We can support programs that offer healthy and filling meals to kids in schools. And if you have the means, you can send a lunch with your child. You can check out websites like YouTube or Pinterest for easy and healthy school lunch ideas. And if you can, donate healthy snacks to the teachers at your child's school. Often teachers are buying snacks out of their own paycheck for the children who come in hungry, and that can take a real toll on the teachers. It always helps to have healthy food in the room for them to give to students who can't bring it themselves. And check your area for donation drives. You can either receive supplies for your child if you need it, or if you can donate supplies so that another child, and another family can get supplies. USEF with the Michigan Roundtable does a backpack giveaway every year that I've been a part of a couple of times. That's awesome. There's a lot of things like that where you can get school supplies, you can get backpacks, and you can get help. And overall, almost everything on this list we can vote for. You can vote for people to go on the school board who support getting better lunches in schools, who support after school care, who support putting more counselors in the schools. And that's all very important. So that's how we can make some changes. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. If anyone has any questions, I will answer questions.
Hey, Hannah. So a couple of things. We have a hard stop at 11:55 because we gotta transition to Zoom to a 12 o'clock. The other part, can you real briefly talk about the context of regionalism, like the different, and talk about the game that you created in that, and why from the regional perspective part of this matters?
Absolutely. So what I had done, just to brief description of the game that I created, it was like a life-size version of Chutes and Ladders, where you walk through a game board, and there are ladders and there are chutes, and you would land on a square, for example, and it might say, you got caught using your phone in class, and you either have to go down this chute, or you climb the ladder, or you stay in place. There were two separate boards, one focused on suburban school districts and one focused on urban school districts. And the outcomes are very different because typically, for example, if you look at like Detroit and Metro Detroit, in Metro Detroit, you have a much higher concentration of white students. And in the city of Detroit, you have a much higher concentration of students of color. You also will see that the policies can differ very much between school districts, and suburban school districts often are not as harsh. So you might, in a suburban school district, as a white student, you might get caught using your phone and your teacher says, hey, put your phone away, please. And you put your phone away and that's that. Or in an urban school district, as a student of color, you might get caught using your phone and somebody says, you just got caught using your phone, now you have detention. Which detention might not be a big deal for some students, but for another student who maybe has to take the bus home from school, now they don't have a way to get home. So depending on where you are, the rules can be different, and the way you're treated as a student in different areas can be very different. Does that kind of answer what you were looking for me to answer, Des?
Yeah, that works. Hold on. Okay. Hey, we don't have feedback. All right. Was there questions from folks?
I have one. This was a long time ago, prior to coming to Detroit. I was the foreman on a grand jury in Houston, Texas. We served 2 tours, so I was on for 6 months. We indicted 8,000 people at 6 months. 72% of the people we indicted were drug-related circumstances. And of those that were indicted, 42% were under the age of 18. And what they were caught doing, of course, was transporting, doing the various things of being the mule, trying to sell it, that kind of stuff. I was able to interview maybe 100 of those kids. There's no question they were in it because there was money. Money that they couldn't get any other way. So there was a motivation, an economic motivation that was, how would I say, almost impossible to overcome in a situation where they weren't going to get money and they were coming to desperate situations. What's your experience and what are the images? Now this was back in 1990s. I doubt if it's changed very much, but the situation is what's the figures that you know of? What's the situation and how do you address that kind of reality?
I don't know of any specific numbers right off the top of my head, but I do know that it is
No, hold on a second. I thought I unmuted the Michigan Roundtable one.
You gotta unmute the computer. There we go, this little button. All right, Hannah,
Sorry, did you hear anything I said or should I start over?
start over.
Okay. I don't know of any specific like actual numbers off the top of my head, but I do know plenty of people when I was living in Farmington Hills, people that I met through the roundtable, people that I met through other means who lived in Detroit, who had that exact issue where when they started growing up and getting into their teen years, the issue was they needed money to support their families. And I had someone tell me his mom even said, please don't start selling drugs. I know we need the money, but please don't do that. And I think even outside of schools and outside of young people, a lot of crime is driven by necessity. Theft, especially, a lot of the time it's driven by necessity. What we can do to mitigate that is we can create programs where people aren't being pushed to steal to get food, create programs where we're supporting people in general, and of course also parents of children, make it easier for people to get what they need so that they don't have to resort to crime to get that money. I think, honestly, I mean, this might be a weird thing to say, but I think there's always going to be a draw because you can make a lot of money doing crime. I think there's always going to be a draw for some people that they look at that and they're like, that's the kind of money I want to make. But when it comes to the crime that's born out of necessity, which I think is the majority of it, we can mitigate that by making it so that necessity isn't there anymore. We don't need to go sell drugs on the street to make sure that we can put food on the table, because that really is what it is a lot of the time with smaller, not, huge kingpin drug dealers or anything, but the people who are just out on the street, they're just trying to put food on the table. So we can create a society where people don't have to do that. And another way that we can do that is, help kids at school. If the issue is putting food on the table, again, we got to make sure that kids have food that they can eat in school. Or we've got to make sure the parents have money so that they can get food to send with their children. Overall, my point is create a space where people aren't relying on crime to survive. We can lower the amount of crime that happens when it's born out of necessity like that. I don't think we can eliminate it, but I do think we can lower it.
All right, so that was Steve telling us we need to wrap up. Okay. Do we have time for one more quick question with Hannah, and then I might be able to answer.
One population you didn't include were offspring of prisoners, of people who go to jail. Is that a high percentage of folks, of the young people that end up going to prison too, out of school?
Yes, absolutely. You guys can hear me, right? Can you guys hear me? Yes, okay. Yes, absolutely. Children of parents who are in prison is one, it's a reason that children end up going down that same route. And it's also a reason that children do worse in school. That's a huge group of people who we see doing worse on, on standardized tests, having behavioral issues in school, are children with one or both of their parents in prison. It's also very, very hard to reintegrate into society when you come out of prison. So it's not just children of parents who are currently in prison, it's also children of parents who've been in prison in the past. One statistic is that it's actually for people reintegrating into society, homelessness rates are actually nearly 10 times higher for convicted felons because it's so hard to reintegrate into society. So it's not just when they're currently in prison, it's also for the rest of their life after they come out. That's a struggle for them and for their families.
Okay, so thank you so much, Hannah. Oh, there we go. Unfortunately, we got to give up the Zoom and so they can transition. Thank you so much. If we have questions that I can't answer, would you be okay with me directly sending them to you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. All right, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you for having me.
We may be losing Hannah, but